This conference will now be recorded.
So in the previous session we have, okay, give me 1 second. Had created the containers, and we created a vectors container and a database container, and they both can communicate each other. And finally we have seen a vectors website, right? And it is the Docker host that I am working on. So now we will talk a little bit about what happened in the container when you created vectors, right? It might sound a little bit strange. All we did is we passed some environmental variable at the time of Docker run command, at the time of Docker container creation. We passed some environmental variable. That is all what we did. And then what happened is inside the container, it got configured. So today we are going to talk about the container configuration. How can you configure a container? I mean, installing software in the container is different, and configuring the container is different, right? Remember when we talked about Wordpress, you need to install Apache PHP, you should download Wordpress files. These are all your responsibility. Then modifying the wp config.php file, then telling Wordpress how to connect to database. This is a configuration what you are doing. Or when you created the MySQL container, you install MySQL, you started MySQL, you did whatever you need to work MySQL, and you created a database, a username and password. This is configuration, right? Do you remember we discussed about basics of configuration? Configuration generally means every software want to know certain information to work properly. That is what mean by configuration. So if I tell you one example, your shopping cart software want to know how to connect to the prime customer software, or WordPress want to know how to connect to database, or some other software they want to communicate each other. So each software want to know the information about the other software, what is the IP address of the other software, or if you want to connect to a database, what is the name of that database, what is that username and password that you can use to connect to the database, and on which IP address database is located. Right? There are some information every software component want to know, and these are called configurations. So in order to configure a Docker container, all you have to do is pass some environmental variable, right? That's all we did yesterday. In the last class when we set up WordPress, all we did is we had passed database credential to WordPress. We told WordPress these are the credentials using which you can connect to database, and WordPress automatically made the modification to the wp-config.php file, so without your involvement, and which is perfect, right? That is perfect because you don't even have to log into the container if you want to configure the container. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the configuration. How can you configure a Docker container? And we will take WordPress and MySQL as the examples to discuss the configurations on containers. So Let's talk about it. So think about your Docker host. You have a Docker host. Can I remove drawing this Docker host anymore? I mean, now you understood all the containers and image. They reside inside a Docker host, right? So I'm just getting rid of that. I'm just from now I am drawing the images. Images I will draw in circles. Container I will draw in square. So you will understand which one is image and which one is a container. So in the last class, you had a WordPress image and then you also had a MySQL image. Right, there was a MySQL image and there was a WordPress image, and you got these images from hub.docker.com. And then what you did is you created a container from first image, the WordPress image, and then you created a container from the MySQL image. So here you have the WordPress container, and here you have the MySQL container. And it is not a surprise that in this container you have Apache PHP MySQL module, and then WordPress files in the www HTML folder. None of these are surprises because the image contained everything. Image had WordPress file, Apache PHP, the MySQL module, and everything. The only surprise is that how did the wp-config.php file got modified, right? That is one thing we need to talk about. How this container got configured, or how this wp-config.php file got updated automatically, and WordPress is now able to connect to MySQL. How this happened? All you did is you just passed the environmental variable, right? You just passed some environmental variable at the time of container creation, and that did the job. When you created the container from this image, you pass them environmental variable indicating IP address of the database, username, password, the database name, and wp-config.php got everything. So we need to discuss how that happened. And similarly, in case of MySQL also, from the MySQL image, you created a MySQL container, and inside the container, automatically the MySQL got installed and MySQL got started, right? Everything is not a surprise because the MySQL image itself, it contained the MySQL installation, and the MySQL service starting pattern was there. So all good, but how a database got created in it with a selected name, right? You WPDB is the name of the database. WP user is the name of the user. Devops 12345 is the password. So how that happened? Database creation, user creation, and password creation. How that happened? So that is exactly what we are going to talk about. What did we do? All we did is we passed some environmental variable at the time of container creation, and automatically, right, we pass the database name, we pass the username, password, database got created, user got created, and password also got created, and everything happened at one shot. And after the containers are ready, since I specified the same database credentials here, and also the same database credentials here. Now WordPress will connect to the MySQL container with the correct credentials, and anyone who connect on port 80 of your WordPress container, they would be able to see the WordPress page. We have seen that yesterday. We did some port forwarding, of course, but yeah, anyone who connect to this container on port 80, you know that they will see a proper WordPress page. Great.
Basically, I think you are muted.
I'm not sure how that happened. So what I'm trying to say is there is a startup program that will run at the time of running a container, right? At the time of running a container, automatically some startup program will execute in the container, and it is that startup program that will configure the container. So in case of WordPress, what the startup program did is it modified the wp config.php file with whatever credentials that you passed as the environmental variable. And similarly, in case of MySQL, what happened is a database got created, username got created, and password got created, and it is the startup program who created them by accepting the values from the environmental variables that you passed. So remember, every time a container start in the whole world, this is not about WordPress or MySQL, this is about any Docker container in the world that gets started, a startup program will execute inside that container. So I will talk a little more about the startup program, and then I will take your questions. Right? Somebody is Hyderabad, is it you? Somebody is unmute. Can you mute? Okay, thank you. All right. Let me talk about what is a startup program, right? A startup program will run at the time of container startup. Every time a container get created, the startup program will run, and it can use some environmental variable that you specified in the container. So this can be a simple program, this can be a PHP program, or it could be a Python program or a shell script, right? Most commonly it would be shell script, whatever, right? Whatever the program is, once it got executed, it would configure the container. That is exactly what the program will do. And this program is very special. This program decides the life cycle of a container. Right. So you can, in other words, you can say the purpose of this container is to run this program. Whatever the startup program is, that is what the container will execute by default. And if the program ever gets terminated, container will also stop. So I will come to that. I will talk about that. So before that, I will clarify how exactly this environmental variable worked. So let me clear this picture. So think about this situation. Think about a generic situation of creating a container from an image. Forget about WordPress and everything. So every time you create a container from an image, I told you a startup program will run inside the container, and it is possible that you can pass some environmental variables at the time of container creation. And this variable would become environmental variables inside the container. And any program, including the startup program running on your container, they can use those variable what you passed. So you will use that. So for example, every time you start a container, you have to do something. Probably you want to start a service. In case of a Apache container, you want to start the Apache service. Start Apache. In case of WordPress, that must be done. Apache must be started. And in case of WordPress, you also need to modify the wp config.php file. So there would be certain configurations that one want to do inside their software. So they will set up the image in such a way that the image has the startup program, right? The startup program is available on the image, and also this program is specified as the default startup program in the container. What that means is every time a container get created from this image, automatically that program will run, and that program will take the environmental variable that you passed, and then it will configure the container. And this is the approach Docker developers uses in order to configure the container. For WordPress, what is mean by configuration? You want to modify the wp config.php file with the correct database credentials. That is what mean by WordPress configuration. And every software will have different configurations. For example, your shopping cart software, it is a Java. Assume it is written in Java programming language, and you have a Java executable file. And at the time of container creation, you want to execute that Java executable file, or probably at the time of container creation, you want to pass the database credentials to the shopping cart container, or you want to pass the prime customer details to the shopping cart container. So there are some information that you want to write inside a production container or inside a running container, and it would be the responsibility of the startup program to do it dynamically at the time of container creation. You can do the configurations only at the time of container creation. You cannot hard code the name of the database, username and password in the image. Don't do that, because if you hard coded, then that would become permanent. Any container that you create, it will have the same database credentials. That is not what you want. Once you have an image, then you should be able to create any number of containers, and each container can have different database credentials in it. So you should be, at the time of container creation, you should be passing some environmental variable, and whatever you passed would be configured inside the container by the startup program. Startup program will run in every container and configure it, and if it needs some value, it will take those values from the environmental variable, and that is the way how startup program works. So what you will write inside a startup program, we haven't written anything yet, we will later, but my point here is that the startup program configures a container. At the time of container creation, you may want to edit some file, you may want to start some service, you may want to do something dynamically at the time of container creation, and it is the startup programs who takes care of all that. So we will talk about it in detail in the coming thing in the next session. So this is what a startup program does. And also one more thing is very important in case of a startup program. Very important. Every time a container gets started, startup program will run inside the container. I already told you that. And if this startup program ever gets stopped, do you know what will happen? Actually, the container gets stopped. I know it might be a bit confusing. Don't worry. So this is by design. Docker is designed in this way. Every time you create a container from an image, a startup program will execute inside the container, and that startup program also determines the life cycle of a container, how long the container will stay, as long as the startup program is running. I will clarify this, in a lab, and where I will show you that in a lab. But remember this: container gets stopped when the startup program stops. And what is the other way a container can get stopped? You can manually stop it. Yesterday, you have seen by running Docker stop command, you can stop a container. That is one way of stopping a container. The other way of container getting stopped is when the startup program finishes. That is the life cycle of a container. Startup program determines the life cycle of a container. All right, so that's pretty much about the startup program. So I will show you the lab and everything. So before that, if you have any questions, please go ahead. Anyone, any questions?
Bezel, like while creating a database, we have provided password in environment variables, right? So now after creating a container with the hyphen username and password, and now I need to change the password in the case. So I need to stop the container and kill the container and then again recreate, or I can edit the new password.
Exactly. So that's what you will do. And yeah, that is another interesting thing about Docker. You will never log into a Docker container to make some changes. You would rather delete and recreate it.
Okay.
Yeah, that is a big statement. We will be discussing that in detail in the coming session.
Okay, the startup program, what you're talking about, is that like specific to the Docker or specific to the image?
Basically, a startup program is stored inside the image. Generally, there would be startup program stored inside the image. When it will run, when it will get executed only at the time of creating the container. So physically, I mean, whatever files container need, it would be there inside the image. Right? Apache installation is there inside the image. A PHP installation is there inside the image. Yes, startup program is also there inside the image. It will execute inside the container once the container got created. That's the first thing what happens once the container got created. All right, so let us continue. So now let us talk about the startup program, in practice. I'm going to, I got disconnected 1 second. Give me 1 second. Sorry.
Basil, can we create our own startup program, or the startup program is already present in images that we used for like MySQL and
In
these
our
things?
case, that was right. In our case, the image was already present. But yes, it is you who will create the startup program, or it would be the developers who would create the startup programs. All right, so
Okay,
let us
so
see.
as you say,
Go ahead.
yeah, so as you say, like in images, we have to start up in images. But if I want to create the like startup program, so I have to create in container and then I can commit that into the images, right?
Exactly, exactly. Today we are going to do
Okay.
that. We are going to develop our own Docker image for vectors. So yeah, what
Okay.
is said exactly what we are going to do. Yeah. All right. So let us do some practice to understand the concept of startup program. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to, the Docker images command would show you the list of images. Docker ps command would show you the running container. So I don't have any container. I'm going to create a new container. So I'm going to use an image called Ubuntu. There's an official Ubuntu image in hub.docker.com. If you go to hub.docker.com and if you search for Ubuntu, you would actually find an image with the name Ubuntu. So can you tell me, so what is meant by Ubuntu? Does that Ubuntu Docker image contain the complete Ubuntu operating system? Is that what it means?
Yes, Vasil.
No, actually the answer is no. The container will look like an Ubuntu operating system. The container, no containers contains an operating system. So Ubuntu image simply means that this image has some libraries and binaries that will make it look like Ubuntu. The actual kernel and actual operating system container always use is of the Docker host, right? Containers always use the operating system and libraries of Docker host and make it look like a real machine. And in case of Ubuntu image, it does not really mean that this image has the complete Ubuntu operating system. No, it has certain binaries and libraries, for example apt-get or related specific to Ubuntu, certain libraries and binaries that will make it look like a real Ubuntu operating system once the container got started. It's as simple as that. Okay, right. So for your information, no Docker images contains an operating system. All right, so what I do is, you don't have to run the Docker pull command all the time. You can actually directly execute Docker run space Ubuntu. Automatically, the image will be pulled from hub.docker.com. You don't have to do that. All right, so I'm going to run this command. Now, automatically, the image Ubuntu gets pulled from hub.docker.com and the container get created. So container got created. You run the docker ps command. All right, the container got created and container got stopped as well. Do you have any idea why the container got stopped? I just created a Ubuntu container by running this command, but I don't see that in the output of docker ps. But if I run docker ps -a, I noticed that a container got created from Ubuntu image. This is the container id and this is the image from which container was created, and the command, this is the startup program. Every container runs a startup program, and in case of this container, a container created from the Ubuntu image, this was the startup program, and the program got exited and the container got stopped. So sometimes after running the docker run command, you try docker ps, you don't see the container. Most probably this is the reason. Container got created and it got stopped as well immediately. Makes sense? So this command, whatever the command was, for some reason it got stopped, and that is the reason why the container got stopped, right? So now let me run this, docker run Ubuntu. And
So Basil, this is by default, like once the program is started, container will automatically stop, or like sometimes it happens. So
always. Let me,
Okay.
I'll complete this and I will take your questions. All right. I will just show you the startup program, how it works, right? So previously, when you executed the Docker run Ubuntu, some default program, what was it? It was bin bash that got executed inside the Ubuntu container. So I will just clarify using a picture. So you have the Ubuntu image, Ubuntu Docker image, and from the Ubuntu Docker image, you created a container. And at the time of creating the container, there is a startup program. And in case of Ubuntu, the startup program was /bin/bash. And this program is stored inside the image, and it was set as the default program at the time of container startup. And this is a image setting. I did not mention what is the startup command that should be executed. I just ran docker run Ubuntu. That's all I did. Automatically, this was the program that got executed in the container by default. And yeah, every image has a default command that you can specify. And that program will run at the time. So when I executed the docker run command, what happened is a container got created, and inside this container, this program got executed. And unfortunately, for some reason, this got killed. The startup program got killed. And as soon as the startup program gets killed, Docker will stop the container. That is how Docker works. As soon as the container, the startup program stops, it would stop the container as well. And that is the reason why our Ubuntu container got stopped. And if you want to pass your own command, let's say instead of running bin bash command, I want ls command to be executed as the startup program. You can override it from the command line. When you execute the docker run command, automatically it will take the default command. If you want to use your own command, for example, ls command, you can do that. You can just pass that command at the time of docker run command. So let's see. Now I want to execute ls as the startup program. So the command will be docker run ubuntu space ls. So here I am specifying ls as the startup program. So instead of bin bash, whatever the default program is, in case of Ubuntu, default program was this, but I don't want that to be running. I want this to be running inside the container. So you can override the default command. So can you tell me what will happen in this case? I am passing ls as the command. What will happen in this case?
It will
Will
list
the
out.
container,
It will list out the files.
it will create a container, and in the container it will execute ls as the startup command. That's what will happen. And my actual question is I have the Ubuntu image. So instead of passing the bin bash, I want to pass ls as the startup command, and that is what I am doing in the docker run command. Any idea what would happen then? In the container, ls command get executed for sure. And what after that? How much time ls command will take to execute? Hardly 1 second, or maybe some milliseconds. That's all. Ls command is not a command that will stay for a longer time. It is a short-lived command. What ls command does is it would show you the files and then it will quit. Then it will terminate itself. And what will happen when ls command quits? Container gets stopped. So this is the only thing what will happen. Container get created, ls command will execute in it, and then the container gets stopped. So let's see if that is exactly what happens. I'm going to my command line. I execute this command. then what happened is a container got created, and in the container it executed the ls command. And now let us see if the container is still running. No, it is not running. As soon as the ls command finishes, container will stop. Now you understand what is a startup program. A startup program runs in the container at the time of container startup, and if the program ever gets killed, your container will stop. So if you don't want your container to get stopped, you want the container to stay, what you must do? You want to create a container and you want that container to stay. You will choose a startup program that will stay, right? ls is not the right command if you want the container to run for a long time. ls is not the right command in that case. Probably the cat command. Cat is a linux command. If you run it without any argument, it will stay in the foreground. You want to see the cat command on linux? This is my linux machine. Let me run cat command to demonstrate. So this is how the cat command behave. You execute cat command and it will stay over there in the foreground. Unless you press Ctrl C, it won't stop. So cat is a command that stays. So if you choose cat to be the command at the time of container creation, so let me now create a Ubuntu container, docker run Ubuntu. Minus ti, I'm also using minus ti option to get a interactive session. That must minus ti should be put. So instead of ls, I specify cat command. I specify cat command instead of ls, and let me also put minus d option so that I will get back my command line. So what will happen? A container got created. Run the docker ps command. Do you think the container would be staying? Yes, it is staying because cat command stays. Cat is a command that stays in the foreground, and if the cat command ever gets terminated in later point of time, right, sometimes it can happen. Sometimes in your windows pc, your chrome browser can crash. Same thing can happen in the container also, right? The cat command can get crashed, or maybe somebody stopped it, or it can happen. So if the cat command ever gets killed, container will stop. And that is the life cycle of a docker container. Something to keep in mind throughout this entire training. Startup program stops, container will stop. You can restart the container, then automatically the startup program will run again. But in a running container, startup program stops, container will stop. Then you have to again restart the container. Restarting the container will restart the startup program also. All right, so that is what a startup program is, and this is how Docker container creation works. So in case of WordPress, let me give you another example. In case of WordPress, can anyone assume what are the different things our startup program did? Definitely, right? In case of WordPress, when we created the WordPress installation, so let's talk about WordPress. From the WordPress image, you created a WordPress container, and definitely there was a startup program, probably a shell script or some kind of script, whatever it is. There was a startup program that got executed here. So can you assume, so when the container got created, it executed this, and then it took the environmental variable and it modified wp-config.php file I told you. So can you tell me, sorry, I should have been asking you that question. What do you think? What our startup program would have done to this container when the container started up? One thing for sure, the wp-config.php file got modified with whatever credentials that you passed as the environmental variable for sure. This is one thing that happened. Anything else? it also started Apache, right? It's the Apache who will be running vectors, right? Who will be serving vectors. So Apache service must be running inside the container. So Apache service must be started. So these are the things you should do. You should configure inside a WordPress container. So the same thing would have been done by the startup program. In case of a WordPress container, these are the responsibilities of a startup program. First one is modify wp-config.php file with the correct credentials of database, and the second thing is start Apache. Now the container is ready to accept connections on port 80 to give WordPress page to the clients such as browsers. So every software application will have such kind of requirement, right? You have the shopping cart software, you have a shopping cart image, right? You have a shopping cart image with you, and from that shopping cart image, you want to create a shopping cart container. So when you do that, when you create a shopping cart container, you probably want to tell the shopping cart container how to connect to database, how to connect to prime customer. So there would be some configuration file, just like you have wp-config.php for WordPress. You may have, config.java in this particular container. Whatever it is, you have to modify that file with the correct database credentials. Then you want to execute the Java executable program, right? You might want to do certain things, right? For any container that starts up, you know what to do, and you must do that, or your developers know what to do. You would do that by creating a startup program, and in the startup program, all these steps would be written one by one, right? Modify the config file, update the credentials, then execute the jar file, Java executable file, right? Whatever you want to do at the time of container creation, do it. It's the startup program who will do it. So it is you or the developers who will be creating the startup program that will run at the time of image startup, and that will not only configure the container, that will also determine the life cycle of a container. Startup program terminate, container gets stopped. But then I have another question. If container get killed when the startup program terminates, so assume in case of WordPress, you start Apache. Modifying wp-config.php is a one-time command. Then starting Apache is another thing. Now let's see. So assume you are a developer, or you are the one who is managing WordPress. You want to make sure that Apache must run always inside the container. If Apache ever get killed, container can stop or container can restart, because there is no reason for the container to stay if Apache is not running. So you should start Apache. Great. So what command do you use in Ubuntu for starting Apache? What command did we use? Service Apache to start, remember? So assume you executed this command. When you executed that command, how much time the command took? Service Apache to start? It took only 1 second or less. What the command basically is, it started Apache and the command got killed. So what will happen if the command get killed? Container will stop. Yes, what I'm trying to tell you is that service Apache to start is the command that you know can start Apache, but this is not the right command for your Docker container. What is the problem in this command? This command will run, it will start Apache, and then the command will finish. After starting Apache in the background, this command will finish. command finishes and container will stop. So I am telling you, even though you want to start Apache, this is not the command you must be using. This command will cause the container to get killed. We will use some alternatives. That is what we are going to do. We are going to develop our own WordPress image. This image we are going to develop ourselves. Okay, we will do that in the next session. So any questions? We will discuss that after the break. The image development we will discuss after the break. So so far, any questions? Anyone?
Basil, do we have Docker logs?
Yes, yes. Whatever logs are there in the container, there's a command called docker logs space container ID. It will print those logs. Yes.
Thanks. Tim.
All right. So take a short break of maybe 5 minutes, right? And we will continue after 5 minutes. Okay. Short break for 5 minutes.
This
Developing an
conference
image.
will now be recorded.
Basil, I have one question.
Yes, Nikita, go ahead.
Yeah, yesterday when we create a WordPress container and run docker ps command, the container was getting in running stage, right? So for Ubuntu, why it's not showing, like it's getting stopped, or when we run the docker ps, it's not showing any container running.
Because it was stopped. It was stopped because
Yeah,
the
but for
startup
it,
program. Yeah. In case of WordPress, it
so
didn't
it is
happen.
any different.
Yeah. In case of WordPress, it did not happen after creating WordPress container. We run the docker ps command. It was running. What would be the reason? It's all about startup program, right? The startup program is still running on the WordPress container, but that is not the case for Ubuntu. In case of Ubuntu, the startup program got stopped.
Okay.
Right?
So it's depend
So
on image, right?
it depend on the image. Yes, it depend on the image. Depend on the startup program, to be precise. The startup
Hmm.
program is stored
Okay.
inside the image. So yeah, that's what it means. So just I am just quickly
Okay.
clarifying that once again, how it happened. Sorry, what exactly happened. Can you all mute yourself? Somebody is unmute, it seems. Please mute. Yeah, thank you. So can we extend today's class for 15 minutes? Otherwise, we won't finish. Yeah, we will extend for 15 minutes for today. Sorry for that. All right. What we did is, from the vectors image, we created a container in the last class, and then from Ubuntu image, official Ubuntu image, now you have created a container, an Ubuntu container. So it doesn't matter what the software is inside it, right? I mean, maybe inside Ubuntu there are some libraries and binaries. Here also it is there. In case of vectors, there was Apache, PHP module, or different things inside the image, and the container would also contain the same thing. So that is the basic principle how Docker works. Whatever is there in the image, it would be available for the container. And startup program would also be there in the image. There's a startup program for every Docker images, and there will be a default startup program inside the image, and that is the program which will run in the container when the container starts. And this startup program stays, container will stay. Startup program get killed, container get killed. That is the simple principle. So if you create a image, create a container from an image, and the startup program started running in that container as soon as the container started, that is the behavior. And if this program stays, container will keep running. That was case for WordPress. After creating WordPress, you run Docker PS, WordPress was running. But after creating the Ubuntu container, you run Docker PS command, it was not running because ls command or bash command, the default commands, actually they got killed as soon as they started. ls command did not get killed, I mean ls command finished and it completed. But the cat command, when we started the container with the cat command, then the container stayed because cat is a command that stays, so the container will stay. So why container is getting stopped? One reason is you can manually stop it by running docker ps command, as we have seen in the previous sessions. The otherwise, the only reason is the startup program got stopped. Whenever the startup program gets stopped, container will stop. If startup program keep running, container will stay. This is a rule you will keep in your mind throughout this training. All right. Okay, great. So in case of WordPress, I know what to do, right? I mean, WordPress is a non-application for both of us, right? If I ask you, how can I successfully run WordPress? You know the answer. There must be Apache installed, PHP must be installed, index.html, the default index.html file will be deleted from the var www.html folder. WordPress files will be copied into var www.html folder. wp-config.php file should contain the correct credentials. So these are the things you have to do. Forget about database part. Creating database is a different thing, right? It's a different container. So from the WordPress web server perspective, these are the things you need to accomplish. And how about the WordPress database server? What are the things you need to accomplish? MySQL must be installed. MySQL service must be running. A database should be created. A user password should be created and given full permission to database. So, right, you already know WordPress and how to set up WordPress, and we are going to develop a WordPress image. To develop an image, you must know the application. In our case, I am taking the same WordPress. Instead of using the official Docker image from hub.docker.com, this time I decided to develop an image myself. Then I must know what is the software I'm going to run inside. I know that it is WordPress. And what are the dependencies of WordPress? I mean, what are the other software WordPress need? It need Apache, it need PHP, it need the MySQL module, it need wp-config.php file modified and all the WordPress files in the var www.html folder. So I am going to develop such an image which would contain everything. All right, so I will tell you the steps, right? I told you once you have set up a container, it is possible technically you can SSH to this container, you can work on this container, you can execute apt-get update command, apt-get install command, install Apache 2, right? You can actually technically work on a container and do whatever you want to do. You can use the wget command to download something to the container. You can use the nano editor to edit something inside the container. You can configure a container and then you can take one final image of that container. You know, this is called your final Docker image. And then you will keep this image, and from this image you can create a number of containers. So to develop such an image, first of all, you need a number of container, I mean probably one container where you will install everything and then you will commit an image. This is the manual process. This is the manual process of creating an image. Once you have the image ready, using docker run command, you can create containers from it, right? Using docker run command, you can create a number of containers from that image. Right? Docker run command will create a container. You can use the docker run command multiple times. It would create a multiple containers. So we are going to talk about how to develop such an image. That is our plan. So yes, first of all, you need a temporary container where you want to set up everything, and finally commit an image. That is the way how you develop an image. So let's talk about it. Let's talk about how to develop an image. So every time you want to develop an image, you have to create a container, install different software in it, and configure it, then commit a final image. This is a manual process, right? Nobody wants to do a manual process. The truth is you don't have to do it manually. The truth is you can create one single file, and inside this file you can write down the steps to develop the Docker image. I can mention something like this. I want to start from the official Ubuntu image. And from that official Ubuntu image, I want to create a temporary container. And inside the container, I want to execute the command apt-get update. And then I want to execute the command apt-get install Apache 2. Then I might also want to install apt-get install lib Apache 2 mod PHP. And then I want to install PHP MySQL. Then I want to download the WordPress files. Then I want to extract them, or I want to I want to extract this file into the www.html folder, and then I want to delete the index.html file from the www.html folder, because after installing Apache, one default file will come. I don't want that. Then I want to modify the wp-config.php file with correct database credentials. So you can just write all the steps in one file, and then you can tell Docker that these are the commands to create an image. Please create my WordPress image. Then what Docker does is, Docker will read your file. It will read all the instructions and it would create your final image. And this final image will have, it would be taken from official Ubuntu image. On top of Ubuntu image, you run the apt-get update, apt-get install Apache, install PHP, install the PHP module, then download WordPress into www.html, delete index.html, configure wp-config.php file, and also maybe the startup program. Startup program are stored inside the image, so create the startup programs. So you put everything together, and then you give this file to your Docker. Docker will read this file and execute this file to create your final WordPress image. In our case, we are discussing WordPress. For any application, I mean, if you know the steps how to configure that applications, you can write all the steps in one single file, which you generally call Docker file. That is the common name that we use. Docker file. You create this is a text file. You create a text file called Docker file and write all the instructions in that file. Then Docker will execute this file and you will get your final image. This is how you develop a Docker image in a more automated way using a Docker file. So let's talk about that. And all these steps, the way how Docker create an image is same. Even though you have written all these steps in one place, right? If we started from Ubuntu, and maybe don't download WordPress. WordPress would be already there. All you need to do is copy the WordPress files. Copy the WordPress files into www.html folder using the cp command, right? Yeah, whatever. And the image must have a startup program. Remember, assume you from this file you created a final image. The image must have a startup program. Remember, because this startup program should be capable to do many things later when you create a WordPress container from your own image. This startup program, whatever you are writing here inside the image, it will run at the time of container creation. And what all things the startup program have to do? It would modify the wp-config.php file, then it would start Apache. So this is also your responsibility to develop a startup program. And this startup program, it will later run inside the container when you create it. So let us, let us do all these things. Forget about the container for the time being. Let me erase all that. Let us focus on creating the image by following these instructions. So I will tell you how exactly this will work. So you have all the instructions which you wrote inside a file, right? This is your Docker file. This is your Docker file. That you have written in order to develop a final Docker image. So assume this is the final Docker image that you want to develop after following all the steps one by one. So I will tell you how Docker will execute this file. Docker will see this file, Docker file, with instruction to develop this final image. The exact process is, it would start with a container. It would first create a container, and this container is for, sorry, I'll just keep it here for copy pasting. So first thing what the Docker process does is, it see this line saying start from Ubuntu. Then it will download the Ubuntu image from hub.docker.com, and then from the Ubuntu image it would create a container. That is the first step it will do. And then the next thing what it does is, it will create a, it will run this command apt-get update in this container. And once the apt-get update command is finished, it will commit a new image. So this is how a new image will look like. So this image have apt-get update in it, the latest update that is executed through this container. And the next step is install Apache, apt-get install Apache. Then what happens is, a new container get created from this image. And inside the container, it will execute this command apt-get install Apache, and Apache get installed inside the container, and then it will commit a final image. And this final image will have Apache installed in it, and also whatever was there in the previous image, right? It has apt-get update up to date. Now on top of that, Apache got installed. The next step is to install PHP module. Again, the same process is what Docker will do. It would create a new container from this image, and inside that it would execute this command installing PHP. And once PHP got installed, a new image get committed, and this new image has PHP in it. Perfect. So this image has not only PHP, it also has Apache, it also has apt-get, whatever was there on top of it, PHP got installed. The next step is to install the MySQL module for PHP. Again, the same process will repeat. A new container get created first, a temporary container get created first, and inside the container, the MySQL module get installed. And after installing the MySQL module, it will commit a new image. And this new image would have MySQL module in it. And then what is the next step? The next step is to copy the WordPress files into the var www HTML folder. Again, a temporary container get created. To that container, WordPress files will get copied, and a final image get committed. Right, and a final image get committed. Then what is the next step? Delete index.html. Same process will repeat. A temporary container get created, and index.html will be deleted. So the final image will have WordPress here, and then after removing index.html file, it would commit a new image. It will have index.html deleted from it. And then assume you already prepared the startup program, and you want that to copy that startup program also into this image. Again, you will create a temporary container, and in that temporary container you would copy the startup program, and after copying the startup program you will commit another image. You will commit another image from it, and now you have the startup program in it. Inside the Docker image you have the startup program, but how would you know that this is the program to be executed when you create a container? So for that you have to do something. You want to make a startup to be the default program of the image. By default, this is the particular program it should run. So you have to do some small settings, right? Set default, make the default program you will do in the container, and then you will commit a final image. Your final image. This is your final WordPress image. That you have just built yourself. And from this container, anyone who create a container, what will happen in the container? This startup program, whatever it is, because you set it as the default, That program will execute in this container, and assume what startup program does is it would modify wp-config.php file, it would start Apache. These are the two things. Assume we will write the startup program later, right? It will be a shell script inside which we will write the steps to modify wp-config.php and start Apache. We will write it down. So, and we will make that as the default program. So every time from your final image, anyone in the world create a container, it would start Apache, it will listen on port 80. Anyone who connect on the container on port 80, they can see the WordPress page. So all you have to do is you just create the Docker file. That is your responsibility. You will create this Docker file and then you will execute this Docker file. There's a command called docker build that you will execute on a Docker host, which will read this file and follow all the steps one by one until your final image get created. Sounds great, right? Every time you want to make some change in the image, you make change in the Docker file and again execute this file. The latest file will have the updates. And let's say in some step you are copying the WordPress files into www.html. So assume your company is developing more programs for WordPress. You made some code change. So every time this file get executed, it is the latest code of your developer that get copied into the final image. So this would be a continuous process. Developer make code change, you will build the latest image once again. You will build the image 1.1 first, and then your developer makes some change. Then you will build 1.2, you will build 1.3, right? That is the approach that you will follow. You understand what I'm saying? So this would actually become automated, and you can build one image today, and this week your developer made lots of code modification. Next week you take the same file, execute the same file, and then what you are creating is a new version of the image. The new image that you build next week would contain the latest code modification of your developers. So this is the final image that you will keep developing, and that image is capable to create containers properly with the latest code. All right, so can we do that? Yeah, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to create this file first, the Docker file. So I go here into my Linux command line. Command, stop. 1 second. Okay, guys, so just assume that this is the machine, your AWS machine. This is where I want to create the Docker image. This is your AWS machine. So my plan is I will download the WordPress file to this machine. I will create the startup program in this machine. Both WordPress files and startup program I want to copy into the Docker image. So I will develop my Docker file. The Docker file will have the steps to install Apache, install PHP, copy WordPress file, copy startup program, make startup program the default, right? All these things. So before I start developing the Docker image, do you mind if I create the startup program first? I will create the startup program first, okay? So let me create the start. First of all, I will create a folder. I'm creating a folder called WordPress, and inside the folder, first of all I want the WordPress files. Let me download the WordPress files. I'm downloading WordPress. Using wget command, right? Right now, remember, I am working on my Docker host machine, right? Nothing else but my Docker host. That is where I am working on. I'm just downloading and extracting WordPress because I want this file to be copied to the Docker image. Let me delete this latest. Now I want to create a startup program, right? Assume startup.sh, or maybe you can name it entrypoint.sh. So some program I will write, and inside this program I will write down the instructions. Modify wp-config.php file with env variables values, right? I mean, this file will get executed later when you create a container from the image, right? So at that time, wp-config.php file will be modified using environmental variable values, right? And that's one thing I have written. And what is the next thing? You want to start Apache start Apache. That is another thing your startup program will do. And also make sure that this command will not terminate. The command terminate, container will stop. So this command Apache should be started with a non-stopping command. The command should not stop, right? If the command stop, container will get get stopped. That's why you should choose your command carefully. Service Apache start is not the right command. So, right, assume you already have the startup program is ready. Then the next thing what you will do is you got the WordPress files, you got the startup program, and now you will create a Docker file with all that instruction. Inside the Docker file, I'm just writing down the instructions one by one. First is I want to start from the Ubuntu image, and then I want to set some environmental variable. I will tell you this later. Debian frontend equal to non-interactive. I'm setting some variable. I will explain this later. This is something we didn't discuss before. Then the next thing, I want to execute this command apt-get update and apt-get install. -y option I am putting so that it is a yes. It won't ask me for the warning. Do you want to continue connecting? I don't want that warning. I want to proceed. So you can use -y in the apt-get install command for that. What are the packages you want to install? You want to install Apache, PHP, MySQL module. Either you can run separate command, or you can run everything under single apt-get install. So apt-get install support multiple packages to be passed. So I'm not writing separate lines. I'm writing lib Apache to mod PHP. Even if you separate lines also, it's absolutely fine. Okay. So I am installing all the software that are needed. Then I want to delete. As soon as Apache got installed, a file get created called index.html. By default, whenever you install Apache, this file get created in the www.html. I don't want that file because I want WordPress files to be present here. So that's why I am deleting index.html. Then I want to copy the WordPress folder that I downloaded into the Docker image. In which location? www.html. WordPress is already downloaded, remember? And then I want this folder content to be copied into var www.html of this Docker image that I am developing. And what is the next thing? I want to copy the entry point.sh program because I want this program to be residing inside the image. So in some location inside this image. And I also want to do this. Okay, I want to do one more thing. I want to make sure that this file is executable in Linux. This is the command you will run to make a file executable. chmod 755 space file name, and then I'm doing this cmd equal to entry point.sh. This is the line which set the default program. I told you every Docker image has a default program. When I executed the first time when I executed the official WordPress image, remember docker run WordPress, I ran that command. What happened? Some program got executed in the container. I did not pass ls. Without passing anything, some default program got executed. So within the image itself, some default program was set. That was the case of the official WordPress image. In your case, I want my WordPress image that I am developing must run this default command. What is the default command? /entrypoint.sh. Right, that is where I copied the entrypoint.sh program into that image, and that is the program which must run by default. CMD statement in Docker file insist that this becomes the default program. This is your Docker file. So during the build process, Docker will take all these lines one by one, execute them one by one, and finally your image get developed. Which image? The final image I'm talking about, this image. So I'm going to execute a docker build command. Then what happens is it will take this Docker file which I have just written. Ubuntu container get created, apt-get update command will run in it, and then it will commit a new image. Then apt-get install apache to libapache to mod php will run. It will commit a new image, and then inside that it will run the rm index.html or copy WordPress files. Then image get come. So all the lines get executed one by one until I get my final WordPress image, and this final WordPress image will have startup program copied in it in one of the steps, right? In one of the steps over here, startup program got copied in it, and startup program become the default program or the default command cmd. And that is exactly what this particular line, the last line I have written inside the Docker file, will do. cmd / entrypoint.sh. This would become the default program. Before that, what I did is I copied the startup program entrypoint.sh into the Docker image at this location. That must be done. And then I made that as the default program. What that means is from your image, anybody create a container, that program will run. The program that you kept inside this, what is that program name that you had given? You can give any name. In our case, it is entrypoint.sh. Make sense? Make sense? So you are developing this Docker file right now.
Yeah, I have a
Yeah.
question. For MySQL, we did not write any code of line, right? For that, you're going to create another Docker file for MySQL.
For MySQL, generally you would never do that. For
We take
databases,
the
you always
image.
get an official image. Yeah, we'll use the official image. We haven't written anything for MySQL. Right now, we
Okay.
are working only about the WordPress web application.
So
That's all.
then, what about port forwarding? This web application need a port forwarding, right? That line
When,
also not mentioned.
so when do we need to worry about port forwarding?
When it want to be visible, when
No,
when our
my,
web page.
my question is, I mean, is this the time we need to worry about the port forwarding?
After Docker
Right now,
file
we are
created,
just yeah, right now we are just creating the image. We are developing the image. We are not running the container yet. This Docker file contains the instructions to develop the Docker image. So we are not worrying about running the container yet. We can, for now, we can forget about running container or doing any port forwarding. Right now, our intention is to develop this final image. That's what we are doing.
okay, fine, this. Thanks.
Yeah, yeah. So, just to clarify the question once again. So right now, Docker file, the only intention is to develop the Docker image. This is what we are doing. We are developing our final WordPress Docker image. Don't bother about running the container at this point of time. Yes, once the image is developed, we are going to run the Docker container. Then, the startup program is going to execute in this container. It will listen on port 80. It would modify wp config.php. That would happen. Let us worry about it only when we create a container. Right now, the only intention is to create a container, create an image that would contain the startup program, and a startup program will run by default if you create a container. So right now, let's forget about creating container part. Right now, the only thing what we are doing is we are building this image. So let us build the image. Come on, just 1 second. Okay, guys. Yeah, it is. I know it's a little bit new topic for you to follow. Just pay attention. You have created the WordPress folder where you downloaded the WordPress file at this location. Entrypoint.sh program you created. So what will I write inside the entrypoint.sh program? What my entrypoint.sh program has to do? Assume I created my final Docker image, WordPress Docker image, and from that image, I am creating a container. What would I want the startup program to do? Apache must be started. WP config.php file must be modified, and also the startup program must stay. These three things I make sure when I prepare a startup program. Any developer who prepare startup program for their application, they have to keep these things in mind. Are there any service to be started? In our case, Apache need to be started. Are there any file that we want to modify? In our case, yes, wp-config.php file is something you should modify. And what is your strategy to make sure that the startup program do not stop? Keeping these three things in mind, let me write the startup program. Right now I am writing the startup program because I want to copy this program into my Docker image. I'm not executing it. When it will execute? Only when you create your container. After developing the image, you create your container, then the startup program will run. Not now, but I have to develop it now with keeping these three things in my mind. One is which files to modify, in our case wp-config.php, which service to start, in our case Apache. Then what is your strategy to make sure that the startup program keep running, it never gets stopped? Keeping these three things in mind, I am developing a shell script. It is a shell script that I am going to write. So the first step that I have to do is I want to modify so it's a shell script that I am writing. So the first thing what I want to do is I want to modify wp config file with environmental variable. So first of all, I should modify, remember, in the var www.html, you won't have wp-config.php file. The file name is wp-config sample.php. That has to be renamed to wp-config.php. First, you will rename the file to wp-config.php. The next thing what you will do is using the sed command. Sed is a Linux command using which you can actually substitute a string with a value. So first of all, let's take a look how exactly the wp-config.php file look like and what are the things that you want to replace. So this is the original WordPress config file. Here, you will find database underscore name here, username here, password here, localhost. So these are the four things that you want to replace. You agree with me? So what I will do is I will write my program that will replace all these four values with some variable, with some actual database name, username, and password. So let's do this. When I write my startup program, I'm going to write it down. There is an entry called database name here inside the wp-config.php file. It will be replaced with wpdb. So this is the syntax of the set command. I will tell you what set command will do. Set command in Linux, it will take a file, look for a string like this, replace that string with this string. This string I'm not writing down, and the actual thing what I want to put here is that name of the database. What is it? It will be wpdb or whatever. I'm not putting the actual value here. I am putting a variable instead, wp underscore db. Okay, you will understand why I put the variable later. So similarly, I want to replace username, I want to replace password, I want to replace localhost. So let me do that. Username here has to be replaced with this variable. Similarly, password I want to replace. Password here is the string I want to replace. It will be replaced with some variable called db password. And what is the next thing I want to do? The local host has to be replaced with the IP address of the database container. By default, it is localhost, and it will be replaced with the IP address of the database container. So assume this is the name of the database, name of the user, name, password, database host. The actual values would be put inside this file by replacing these dummy values. So these are the steps that will modify wp-config.php file. And what would be the next thing that you want to do? You want to start Apache, and also at the same time you want to make sure that Apache gets started in the foreground. The Apache starting command must stay. What happens if it gets killed? Container gets stopped. You don't want that. If you run the command service Apache to start, assume this is the command that you already know this command. This is the command we have been using to start Apache, but don't use this command because this command don't stay. But there is, fortunately, there is a command you can search in Google also, right? Run search in Google. What is the command to start Apache in the foreground? I will tell you the command. The command is this. This is the command. It will start Apache and it will run in the foreground. Command won't terminate. That is the whole point, right? So this is the right command to start Apache. It will do the same thing what service Apache to start command will do, but this will start in the foreground. The other command start Apache in the background. When you write in Docker, you need commands that run in the foreground, the command that stays. Make sense? That's why I choose this command over service Apache to start. So that is my script. I wrote this script. I am done with it. And I want this script to be inside my Docker file, right? I already wrote the instruction for that. Copy the script into the Docker image at this location. Keep the file as a executable file and make sure that that is the file that will run every time a container gets created. So this, what will happen? I mean, when this program will run, not at the time of image creation, when at the time of container creation later. After creating our image, we will create a container. At that time, this program will run. Not now, not at the time of image creation. At the time of image creation, I needed this file. I want this file to be copied in the Docker image and set as the default file. So that is why I prepared the entry point.sh now itself. And then my Docker file has instructions to copy both entry point.sh and WordPress files into the Docker image, the final Docker image that I am building. The command is docker build. You should run the command from the same folder where you have Docker file. The command is docker build -t. Then you can give some name, let's say my WordPress. You can give any name. If you want to specify a tag, you can do that. My WordPress 1.0.0, maybe the version. And then put dot at the end. It indicates that current folder is the context. WordPress is in the current folder, entry.sh in the current folder, and most importantly, Docker file is in the current folder. So what this command does is it will look for Docker file in the current folder. It will read the lines. It will execute them one by one. I mean, I'm talking about this is what will happen. It start from Ubuntu, run apt-get update in it, commit a temporary image, then create a new container, install Apache in it, commit a new image, then install PHP, MySQL, everything, commit an image, copy the WordPress file, commit an image, delete the index.html, commit an image, copy the startup program, commit an image, make startup program the default and commit the final image. So this is the command. Docker build is the command you execute, which will read this file, Docker file, execute these steps one by one until your final image become ready. This is the image that you are building. All the other images are not important, they are temporary. All these temporary containers are also not important. The final image that you are building is what you need, and later you will be creating containers from that image. At that time it would run the startup program, and when startup program runs here, automatically wp config.php file get modified, and also Apache gets started, and Apache will run in the foreground as per entry point.sh. That's what we have written. Apache runs in the foreground of the container. So forget about container creation right now. Let us execute the docker build command. What docker build command will do, it would create the docker image, final docker image, by executing all the instructions one by one, right? You can see from Ubuntu, it downloaded Ubuntu image, created a container, then it set the environmental variable. So I put this line in the docker file because I don't want any interruption. In Debian based operating system, when you run apt-get install PHP, sometimes it will ask you, what is your time zone? What's your name? What is your email ID? Some information apt-get will ask you when you run the apt-get install command. I don't want any such questions, right? I don't want any such kind of interaction. So if you put this environmental variable, that interaction will not come. That is the reason. This is the behavior of Debian based operating system, including Ubuntu. If you put this line, then no interaction will come. apt-get will take the default settings and proceed. That is why I put this line. So you can see, it is now running apt-get update and apt-get install, right? It is running all the things one by one, and yes, it's done now. Then it deleted the index.html, it copied the WordPress files in the www.html, then the entry point.sh program is copied into the image, then it got the right permission inside the image, it is set as the default program. So everything is done, your final image is now ready. Your final image is created. This is your own image. This is the image I will use to create my WordPress container, not the official image. Right? I don't need the official image anymore. Instead, I created my own Docker image. You can see the Docker images. You can see the image that you created. Now let me create a container from this image. What is the command? You already know the command. Docker run is the command. -p 80:80. Then you have to pass some environmental variable. Also use the -d option to run it in the background. -e option wpdb equal to name of the database that you want to specify. wp user, sorry, db user, wpdb user equal to assume wp user. So whatever variables that you put in the entry point.sh program, right? Same variable I am using here, so that when the container get created, it will take these values to be put in the wp-config.php file. All right. I'm putting some dummy IP 172.17.0.3, something like that. Then you mention the name of the image from which you want to create the container. So I'm executing this command, the same command, the similar command you executed before when you wanted to create the WordPress container from the official WordPress image. This time it is your own image, and these variables are defined by you in the entry point.sh. So whatever value, so I will explain what will happen now when I create a container. by running this command, I'm going to create a container. What happens is, so from this final Docker image, I'm creating the container. Then what happens in the container is, it will run this entry.sh program in it. Startup program will run. This is the time when the program runs, and what the program will do, the first thing it does is it will modify the wp-config.php file using some variable, and those are the exact variable I am passing as the environmental variable along with the docker run command. Entry.sh uses some variable. Remember, WP user, WP DB user, WP DB password, WP DB, WP DB host, those variables we used in the entry.sh. I am passing those variables. Then the entry.sh that executes this will take those variables, use those values to put inside the wp-config.php file. And also it would start Apache in the foreground. Next thing, it would start Apache in the foreground. And now I am port forwarding it to port 80 of the Docker host. That is my AWS machine port 80. I am port forwarding. That's what I am doing here in the port forwarding statement. So execute this command. You run the Docker PS. Your container is running. Port forwarding to port 80. You can browse for your AWS machine's IP. You will see the WordPress. Remember, we haven't created the database, so I will get an error. Since we have not created the database container yet, I will get an error. You already know, right? Same how we did in the previous class. You can create a database container from the official MySQL image. Then whatever credentials, database name, username, password that you use there, you can pass here, and then WordPress will work properly. Right now, if I browse it, I will definitely get an error, database error, that is expected. But you know how to fix this problem. How do you fix this problem? You should create a MySQL image also. So maybe let me show you that. I'm going to create a MySQL image. How do you create a MySQL container? Using the official Docker image for MySQL, right? Yesterday we had already done this. There are some environmental variable that we used, remember? What are the environmental variable for MySQL? Right, the same thing what I did in the last class, right? Previously when we set up WordPress, the same thing, whatever I did, the same thing I'm doing again. I think I am not confusing you. This is a mandatory variable, the MySQL root password that I am passing. Yeah, you can put some value, and then MySQL database is another variable, MySQL underscore database. Make sure that it is the same value that you are using, whatever you used for WordPress, same thing you have to use for MySQL. MySQL user equal to WP user, then MySQL password, right? Password equal to Devops 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Right, it's the same credentials, whatever, right? Here you are creating the database. Here you are passing same database credentials for WordPress. So run this command, right? All good, all good. And this time, probably the database error is gone. Oh, wait. The IP address of the database is not correct. Docker PS, let me check the IP address of the MySQL using the Docker inspect command. I can do that. This is the IP address 172.170.4, but whatever I had given to WordPress is a different IP. So let me stop my other WordPress container and let me create a new container. Oh, sorry, I think I stopped the MySQL container. Sorry. Let me create the MySQL container. Let me stop the WordPress container, and now let me check the IP address of MySQL container and make sure that use the same IP at the time of WordPress container creation. So what is the command to create WordPress container? Here you go. And let me replace this IP address with the actual IP address of MySQL. That's all. So all good. Now try to browse for WordPress and all looks good, right? Now everything looks good. There is no database error. WordPress is successfully connecting to database. Remember, this is your WordPress, not the official WordPress image. You used your own WordPress image this time. Yeah, I hope it makes sense, and I'm sorry it got delayed a lot. I was not expecting this much time. Sorry for that. And tomorrow you don't have class. Tomorrow it's off. Okay. Next class is day after tomorrow. Tomorrow you can take a day off.
This conference will now be recorded.
So yeah, go ahead. Any questions?
Basil,
Yeah,
so I just shared you that snapshot. Okay, please, once you have time, uh,
sure,
please see
sure.
that. Um, though at least I can continue with the work.
Definitely, definitely. I'll do.
Okay, thank you.
Thank
B,
you.
when we run the Docker file, so will the intermediate images will be created, or can we see them, or is just will be deleted when the final commit is done?
Actually, they are not deleted. The way how a Docker image works is they are incremental images. So the truth is that it is not only one image that we created. It is lot of images in a incremental manner. They won't occupy extra disk space because they are incremental images, but none of the images are deleted. They will stay there. I will show you that.
So do we have access to those images?
Yes, we have. If you run the command docker images, you won't see them, but if you run the command docker images -a, you will see them. You can see some images which are not tagged. Tag says none. These are different images, the intermediate images that got created, so they won't be deleted, but you don't bother about them. It is only the final image you bother about them. Technically all the images are present
Okay.
in your Docker house.
So we can delete these images, right, if we don't need them?
Actually, if you try to delete them, you would get an error saying that you cannot delete them because this image is using them.
Okay.
Yeah. So actually, I will tell you how exactly the image building process is. It basically, so this image has Apache in it. This image has Apache installed in it. The next image has everything what this image had along with PHP. The next image has everything the image has along with the WordPress files in it. So this is in an incremental way. So it won't take any extra disk space. It does not consume any extra disk space. The images are, this image actually means a combination of all these together. But you don't really, you can completely forget about that. Whenever you want to copy this image to someone, you can just copy this image to someone and they can take this image. They will automatically get what they want. But technically all those intermediate images that got created during this build process, they are not deleted. They are still there. All these images are still there.
Okay, and Docker file, the commands you wrote like copy, run. So those are the Docker file commands, or just a plain English that we're writing?
This is plain English in this file, right? So I
Yes.
just wanted to, yeah, it is plain English. And the actual Docker file I will send you. It has a syntax. It has a syntax.
I'm
From
talking
means
about this. I was talking about this file.
correct.
Here, when you say copy, you're not giving any Linux command. So these commands are different from the Linux.
Correct. Exactly. Exactly. So these are Docker commands, Docker file commands, and you can see the complete list of Docker files commands. I will explain these quickly. From means where you want to start. env means you want to set some environmental variable. Run, you can execute any command in the Docker image using run statement. Deleting file, rm command, apt-get update, apt-get install commands, whatever commands here, chmod command. Using the run statement, you can pass any Linux command that get executed inside those images. Copy will copy a file from your Docker host to the container, to the Docker image. Same copy statement we are using for copying the endpoint.sh to the Docker image. CMD statement would set a default command for the Docker image. So all these things have meanings. So you can just, I will send you one link. Only these are the commands. I mean, there are one or two other commands also. It's very simple syntax, like a text format, nothing much. You can go through this link which I send you to see all the available commands in Docker. This is the list. This is the complete list. Nothing else. And mostly you would be using env. Run is very commonly used. From is very commonly used. From must be there, right? Everything should begin from a base image. That is where you mentioned from. But these are the possible different options.
So instead of a copy command, we can use run cp as well, right?
Now, a copy command will copy from your build host, Docker host, in our case, AWS machine. That is where we are running the Docker build command. So copy command would copy a file from the host computer or wherever you are running Docker build command. From that computer, it would copy the file to the container. That's what copy statement will do. It's not an internal copy. Remember, WordPress and entry.sh we kept inside our AWS machine. And these files, you want to copy them into the Docker image. So that is where copy statement is useful. So you cannot use the cp command with run. That is different. What cp command will do, within the machine, it will copy one file to another location. Here, this is different. From the machine where we are building the Docker image, we are copying these files into the Docker image. So these two files are now available in this final Docker image that you have built. That's what copy statement means.
Okay, thank you.
Bhardi, yes, we can talk. Yes.
Thank you, Basil. So, can I talk now or?
Let me ask everyone. Anyone else? Any questions? Okay, so let's wind up for today and we will continue tomorrow.